Am I on? Okay, cool. Hi everyone, I am Bryan Heinz. This is From Mac Servers to NAS, The Great Migration. I go by Cookie Lust on Twitter, Heinz on Slack. I live in Peoria, Illinois, which is 3 hours south of Chicago, 3 hours north of St. Louis. I am the IT manager at Simantel, which is a business-to-business marketing firm where I manage on-premise and in-cloud servers, DP, MDM, network, endpoint, everything. I do all the things. I've worked in IT for around 11 years. Synology, I've worked with them for about 6 years or so, a little bit less with QNAP before going to Simantel. And kind of what started me working with Synology was working with Simantel as working for an MSP. Simantel had these old Buffalo drives. They were all one-offs that hosted their archive. People were kind of sick of plugging them in multiple times and searching for the right drive. And then they were also backing up with tape, and the tape drive broke. So we took their server, we installed a Synology, where we put their backups using CrashPlan Pro E. It was kind of weird. Third-party hacked in. It worked surprisingly well, except CrashPlan on the server, which crashed after backing up so many terabytes. But it worked really well in the Synology. We put the archive on there as well. We were hosting multiple terabytes on there. And then we backed that up to a second Synology so that we had redundancy. Real quick, some expectations I'd like to set. This talk will include what a NAS server is, so I'm going to go over that. Kind of a map of macOS server.app services to NAS devices, kind of turnkey solutions. Some other uses for NASs, some tips and advice on using a NAS. This talk won't include how to implement any of this stuff. It's kind of out of the scope, but you can reach us in Slack. There's some channels that can help you. We can give you advice if you need anything and kind of help you out there. And then I'm not going to tell you what you should buy. That's kind of dependent on your organization, what you guys need. What I need is going to be completely different from what you need. And if the takeaway I hope you guys come with is, if NASs are even the right tool for your organization. As I said, my need isn't your need, so hopefully this will give you an idea if this will work for you. And then some ideas for what you can use that NAS for, and then what vendor and models might work for you. Quick disclaimer. I tried to make this talk vendor agnostic, however, it'll be skewed towards Synology. It's what I've been using for the past 6 years. It's what I know. And then Synology and QNAP are kind of the best in case for turnkey solutions. When I started researching this talk, I ended up with about 4 to 5 vendors as I was vetting through them and seeing what they could run. A lot of turnkey solutions didn't work on them, or they were third party and not really vetted or anything. So I slowly dropped them off until I ended up being left with Synology and QNAP. And then I have zero affiliation with any of these vendors. I don't even talk to them unless I have to call support. So not trying to sell anything. I just want you guys to think for yourselves and don't be a sheep. So what is a NAS? NAS stands for Network Attached Storage. They run the big three typically, AFP, SMB, and NFS. But they can do more than storage, and they're relatively cheap. When I worked for an MSP, we were looking at SANs like Nimble, and these came in significantly cheaper. Typically, they're made up of a base or primary unit, which has kind of the CPU, RAM, and other computery bits, and then expansion units, which you can add on for extra storage. They run their own flavor of Linux, typically. On Synology, it's the DSM, which is not to be confused with the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM-5. My wife's a counselor, so I get mixed between these two all the time. And QNAP runs the QTS operating system. They have support for SSHing in and running basic Linux commands like cd, ls, sudo rm-rf/*, stuff like that. And then they have an app store. Synology has the package center. QNAP has the app center, where you can install first-party or first-party vetted software. You can add in third-party app repositories, but Same with the command line installation, which you can do as well. You should use caution, kind of vet them before you use them, make sure they're going to exist in a year and still be maintained and supported. But with that, you can use Synology supports the dpackage command line binary, and QNAP has a Q package to install those. For file systems, both support the ext4 file system. Synology supports BTRFS, also known as ButterFS. And QNAP supports ZFS. So with that basic understanding of NAS, these are a list of turnkey solutions that you can run on either QNAP or Synology. There's quite a few of them. A lot of them map over, which is nice. There are a few that don't run directly as a turnkey solution on a Synology or QNAP. There's still a couple that require Mac OS. So diving in, calendars and contacts, they use a base of, kind of on the back end, they use CalDev and CardDev. And on Synology, you can install Calendar or the CardDev package, which will, Calendar is a full calendaring app, which can be useful if you need that, but you're just using CalDev. But you can plug these into, Calendar on Mac OS or Contacts on Mac OS, and they'll synchronize for you. And QNAP doesn't have a first-party CalDev or CardDev solution. They do have a third-party one that I found and came across called ReadyCale, but you should verify it before you use it. For file sharing, as I mentioned, they support the big three, AFP, SMB, and NFS. They also support WebDev, which is an installable package on Synology and built in on QNAP. For permissions, you can bind it to a directory server and use local or directory permissions. You can mix and match those permissions on a share. You can set quotas. On Synology, they support a share-specific quota or user-specific quota, either or. And then you can also set on QNAP only user-specific quotas. For mail, you shouldn't run your own mail server, which I'm sure people who do it are sick of hearing. But if you want to, Synology has two different mail offerings. You can use Mail Server or Mail Plus Server. Mail Server is a pretty basic, bare bones implementation. Mail Plus Server gives you extra stuff, more than just this, but kind of notable, high availability, some extra stats, auditing, but it also has a cost. So again, it might just be worth it to go to Office 365 or Gmail and utilize their service. It's going to be a lot easier. QNAP agrees, don't run your own mail server. They don't have any first-party support for it. So if that's something you need, then you're going to be wanting to look at Synology or doing it non-turnkey. Messages relies on Jabber. There is no direct Jabber replacement, but Synology has a proprietary chat client called Chat. Works decent, gets the job done. And QNAP supports the open source Mattermost. It's a first-party vetted installable package. For Time Machine, both vendors support it. It's as simple as checking a box. Synology also offers Cloud Station Backup. It is a proprietary backup client with a server component, and it works on macOS and Windows. However, you can't mass deploy it. So if you're an MSP, you're going to multiple clients, they have 10-person shop, would work well. You can just hop to each machine and configure it. Doesn't scale. If you have 100 plus users, you might not want to roll that out, because I did get it to mass deploy and it crumbled fast. So the base image that I used to deploy it, as soon as I deleted that initial backup, the rest of the clients broke, so I ended up not using it because I couldn't mass deploy it. But it's available, it works well if you have a small deployment. QNAP has the NetBack Replicator. It's a proprietary backup client as well, but it's Windows only. It's probably to fill the gap for Time Machine. VPN, it's an installable on both platforms. Synology has the VPN server, and QNAP has QVPN. They support the big protocols, OpenVPN, L2TP over IPsec, and PPTP. And then QNAP also has the QBelt VPN, which is their own proprietary VPN service that requires QVPN client. If you're running your own web server on it, both vendors support that with support for virtual host, which is nice. Synology has a web station package that lets you manage it, and you can install Apache 2.2, 2.4, Nginx 1.13, PHP 5.6, 7, 7.2, MariaDB 5 or 10. QNAP has Apache, PHP, and MySQL built in. The downside there is PHP, when I was researching, got updated earlier this year to 7 from 5.6, so packages seem to get updated with the OS and not as frequently. In that scenario, you might need to look at something else, like running it in Docker. And they support Let's Encrypt, so it's built into the Synology, and QNAP requires the MyQNAP Cloud to be configured with it. But a quick tangent on Let's Encrypt, it is a free, automated, and open certificate authority. It's run by the ISRG, or Internet Security Research Group, and it's safe and secure to use. I wouldn't be surprised if half the web runs on it at this point. It supports wildcard certificates as of earlier this year, which can be really nice for internal applications that don't reach the web. But certs must be renewed every 3 months, and Synology and QNAP can handle that automatically for you, which is really convenient. If you're running macOS Wiki, you can use DokuWiki or MediaWiki on both of these vendors. They both support turnkey installation of it, but there is no automated way of migrating, unfortunately. You can use, if you're using DokuWiki, it uses plain text files, so you might be able to scrape that data and dump it into a plain text file. It's one reason I prefer and really enjoy using DokuWiki is it's just plain text files. As soon as you create a new page, it creates a text file on the back end. Configurations all in plain text, which makes it convenient. If you are running a DHCP server, it's built into QNAP and Synology. It's just turning it on and configuring it. DNS server, there's a package on Synology that you can install and configure. However, QNAP doesn't have a turnkey solution to enable and run. As far as I could tell, you could manage it from command line, but it was a little more complicated, and if that's not something you want to do, you might want to look at Synology instead or something else. For FTP, it's built into both OSs, but I recommend using SFTP instead. It's FTP over SSH and much more secure. If you're using Open Directory, you could install Directory Server on Synology, which is an LDAP implementation, or Active Directory Server, which is Active Directory Server. QNAP has AD and LDAP built in. Quick lightning round, these are our non-turnkey solutions. For Profile Manager, you can run MicroMDM in Docker on these platforms. However, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. I would recommend outsourcing. Just, it's more simple. It might not be worth it to you to manage that all the time. But I hear SimpleMDM's good. As Simantel, we're using Meraki, but I hear SimpleMDM's good. For net install, if you still have a need for that, you can run BSDPy in Docker on a Synology or QNAP. And for software updates, you can utilize Reposado. Runs really well. So I've been mentioning Docker. It is an installable package on both platforms. On Synology, it's just called Docker, called Container Station on QNAP. Both vendors have a Docker GUI, which makes it really nice, easy way to get into Docker if you're not familiar with it. Docker will let you run a lot of services as, you can almost think of a container as a VM, but one service per container. So it uses a lot less resources. But if you want to drop down from the GUI, you can SSH in and run Docker on command line, and it also supports Docker Compose, which is really convenient for automating things. At Simantel, we are utilizing Docker for these things, at least for now. Crypt is probably going away for us, but for now we're running Crypt Server, Monkey Server, Monkey Report, Reposado, DokuWiki, Snipe IT for asset management, Unify Controller. All of this is running on our Docker, running in Docker on our Synology, and it runs really well. It's saved us a lot of RAM and some storage. Some tips and advice. So you're running all of these, or I'm running all these Docker containers, and I'm generating a lot of ports. Reverse proxies are super useful to use. That's how I've solved it. On Synology, it's built in. It's turnkey. It's as simple as running a wizard to pop in all the info. So I can send traffic like crypt.simantel.com to localhost 8080. I don't have to remember 8080. When we're running our wiki on it, our users don't have to remember whatever ports generated for that. And I can also add SSL certs without configuring that destination server. I don't have to add any extra configuration to that container or anything else. It all just is handled by the Synology. If you're running internal and external applications on your Synology, you should enable access control profiles. This will allow you to set, if your subnet, you can say, my local subnet can reach crypt server, but we need the wiki externally so users can, anyone can access outside the web can access that wiki. It's a good security measure to enable that. And on QNAP, it's not turnkey, but you can use something like an Nginx reverse proxy to do it. It's just not as simple. If you get one of these and you need to plug disks in, the most recommended drives typically anymore are Western Digital Red drives. They run really well. The other one is Seagate Ironwolves. Seagate Ironwolves are a little more recommended these days, just because they have a special firmware that has better smart integration that gets utilized. And then I also recommend taking a look at Backblaze's drive statistics. About every quarter, they'll post drive statistics on the thousands and thousands of drives they have in production, and you can see what drives are failing, what drives have been running really long, and it's a great snapshot to look at and know what drives you should avoid. Some advice I've heard a while ago was to buy drives from multiple sources. If you're buying 12 drives, you should buy 4 from Amazon, 4 from Newegg, 4 from CDW, or whatever vendors you choose. The concept here is if you are buying 12 drives, but you buy them all from one vendor, they might all come off the assembly line, and if there's a problem on that assembly line, all 12 of your drives are susceptible to that problem. Whereas if you buy them from multiple vendors, only 4 are going to be susceptible. It gives you a little bit more redundancy there. Once you get those drives, you should check each drive's warranty. If you're buying from Amazon, they have multiple sellers, which are abstracted typically from you. Some of those sellers like to go buy external drives and rip out the internal drive and sell it for a profit. That drive, as soon as you buy it that external drive, that warranty starts. You get that drive, the warranty expires in 3 months. You had no idea. A year from now, that drive fails, you pop it out and check the warranty. Now you're buying a new disk because it's expired. So always check your warranties. And then you should purchase a cold spare. If you're buying 12 drives, you should buy a 13th drive. That way, when one of your drives dies, you can pop it out, immediately pop in that new one, and your RAID isn't at fault or in a degraded state for longer than it needs to be. Don't use RAID 5. You should use RAID 6 instead. As of, I think, once the 2 terabyte drives were introduced, RAID 5 was recommended not to be used, just because how long it takes to rebuild an entire RAID. Just the amount of time for that drive to get rebuilt, it's just not recommended anymore. So RAID 6 gives you 2 drives of redundancy, which gives you more fault tolerance. RAID isn't a backup. It just gives you extra fault tolerance on the disks. It doesn't protect you from data corruption or file deletion or cryptoviruses or users. That data needs to be redundant. And then, again, you should always have a cold spare. If one of your drives fails, you pop in your new cold spare. You shouldn't close that ticket until you go buy a new cold spare, because you don't want that RAID to be degraded longer than it needs to be, and it's going to happen again. Synology also has its own RAID type. It's called SHR, which stands for Synology Hybrid RAID. SHR is the equivalent of RAID 5, so don't use it. SHR2 is the equivalent of RAID 6. It allows for the mixing of drive sizes along with the immediate volume expansion. So in traditional RAID, if you have a 4 terabyte drive and a 1 terabyte drive, 1 terabyte's all you're going to use until they're all 4 terabyte drives. With SHR, you're going to utilize all that space, or a significant more portion of it. And then with that immediate expansion, with a traditional RAID, if you have that 4 terabyte and that 1 terabyte, as soon as you add in another drive, it's just immediately going to give you that space instead of having to replace all of them. Not all Synology models support SHR2. It's typically not recommended for business cases because RAID 6 is faster, so their higher end models typically won't support it, just because they want you to use RAID 6. It is listed under a RAID type on model spec page. Under Synology Hybrid RAID is what you're looking for. And then they also have a RAID calculator, which is very convenient for when you're trying to do the math on their SHR, since it's not a standard RAID type. It can calculate what space you'll end up with if you're using mixing and match drives. For a file system, once you get your RAID built, you got to pick a file system. I recommend using Btrfs or ZFS, depending on what vendor you go with, because it gives you some extra features like data scrubbing and snapshotting. Data scrubbing will repair inconsistencies in the files. So if you run into bit rot on your drives, this will go through and clean that up for you. And then you also need to schedule it. So once you have that file system set up, you need to go back in, schedule a task to have it actually go back through every 1 to 3 months. It's not something you want to run every week because it's very intensive on your disks, and it will degrade your performance for your users and also probably shorten the lifespan of your disks, but it is recommended to do it every so often. And you should definitely schedule it because you're busy and you'll forget. Snapshots are also useful. It's pretty close to a backup without being actually redundant on other hardware. You take a snapshot, they're very fast. User deletes a file, you can go back to the previous snapshot, restore that file for them. It's just a very quick way to bring some data back. But without that replication, if that RAID dies, those snapshots go with it. So snapshot replication, you can replicate to other, if you're using Btrfs, you can replicate to other Btrfs volumes or ZFS to ZFS. So if you have two Synologies, you can send those snapshots and replicate them back and forth. Then if that Synology dies, you can actually light up that snapshot on the secondary one and you're back up with all your data. So speaking of backups, you should back up your NAS. As I said earlier, RAID is in backup. And you can follow the 3-2-1 rule, which is to keep 3 copies of your data across 2 different storage mediums, with one of those being off-site. For local backups, you can use those snapshot replications to replicate to other NAS devices. And Synology also has a hyper backup package, and QNAP has a hybrid backup package. Both have support for block level backups. You can back up to another drive that's attached via USB. You can also back up to other NASs. Those are vendor agnostic because you can back up over stuff like SFTP. So I highly recommend having at least one of those set up. And then with those same tools, you can also back up online to stuff like Amazon S3, Glacier, Backblaze B2, Wasabi. Those are just a few of the online backup options. For if you need to stay online a lot, you need that high availability. It is supported on Synology's, typically their XS and their Plus line, along with QNAP's ES line. You can check a model spec page and see if they have high availability listed or on the software spec page for QNAP. Both models have to mirror each other. So if you have, if you get one Synology, you're buying 2 whole units, and then the drives also need to mirror. So if you have drive bays 1, 2, and 4 filled, the other one has to have 1, 2, and 4 filled. They need to be exact mirrors of each other, and they'll send heartbeats. And then if one of them breaks, the other one just picks up where the other one left off, and you're online all the time. So notifications, definitely something you need to enable. They are not enabled by default or configured. You want to know when your disks are failing, if a fan fails, if something else is going wrong, power supply goes out, without having to walk in your server room all the time. So you should enable notifications. They support both email and SMS. Once you get that configured, you want to test that. If you just set it up and you're like, cool, SMTP settings are set up and good to go, you might be wrong. I've done it. So you should definitely test those, make sure it's all working. Because the last thing you want to do is go into your server room because everything's offline and fan died and you have 3 red blinking lights at you for hard drive failure from overheating. If you're looking to get some extra speed out of these, they support 10 gigabit Ethernet if you have that kind of infrastructure. 10 gigabit is sometimes sold separately, sometimes it's built in. Again, you can check a model spec page to find out. If it's not supported internally, you buy a PCIe card for it, plug that in. You can also set up an SSD cache. Those are either going to be an M2 PCIe card, or you can plug in a SATA drive. Downside to a SATA drive, you're taking up an entire drive spot to utilize that. It's also going to be a little bit slower, probably negligible, but it's going to take up an entire drive spot then. And that PCIe card sold separately. And an SSD cache might not be useful. If you're running mostly as like a video server to edit off of, or just maybe an internal Plex server, you might not benefit from it because those long read-write operations, they're going to take up the entire SSD and then it'll be overwritten and it won't really help you. And then only some models can do both 10 gigabit and M2. So you really want to check your spec page, make sure that 10 gigabit is built in if you want to do a PCIe card. This matters probably more on Synology. A lot of Synologies only have one PCIe card available. I think QNAP's a little different. I think they do have multiple, so you might be a little better off there. But if you're looking at Synology and you want both, you want to make sure that 10 gigabit's built in. Synology has a documented model naming scheme, which is really nice when you go to buy one of these. Just to walk through it real quick. The first character is going to be an R or a D, and that's going to be desktop, so it's going to be tabletop or rack mountable. So immediately you can just scan through a page and say, I want all the R's because I want to rack mount this. The next is going to be an S or an X. The S is going to be that primary base unit with all those computery bits. The X is going to be expansion unit. So if you just need more, if you're looking for more drive space, you're hopping down to those X's, make sure they're compatible. The next two are going to be numbers. It could be 1 to 3 numbers, depending on how many disks are supported, because that's what it is. So in this case, this is going to support up to 36 drives. And then the next two characters will be what year it was released. So in this case, 2017. And then the last two characters are RP, that means redundant power. This changes out a lot. XS is your high performance model, that could be there in place. I believe all XS models have redundant power. And then there's sometimes a plus on there as well. That plus just means it's even more powerful, it has even more specs, more RAM, more CPU. And then it sometimes gets replaced with Play. Play means it has a hardware decoder on it. So if you need to run, if you were trying to run a Plex server, Play might be the one you want because it's going to be able to hardware decode video on the fly. Just to give you a quick look, here's some different models. So we've got the RS18017XS Plus, which is a mouthful. That's going to be a rack station. So it's going to be rack mountable, supports up to 180 drives with expansions. And then it was released in 2017, and it's going to be a high performance model. We've got the DS3018XS disk station, so it's going to be tabletop. It'll support up to 30 drives, released in 2018, high performance. And then the DS418 Play, that's only going to support 4 drives, so it doesn't even support expansion chassis. And desktop model, 4 drives, plays video. QNAP doesn't have a documented naming scheme as far as I could tell. Not a big deal, just it's convenient to know the scheme so that you can quickly find what model you might want. If you're going to support SSH or SFTP into your NAS, you should avoid opening those ports onto the firewall. People will scan for port 22 or port 2222, looking for a way to brute force into that. So you should just, if you can, don't even open it up. If you need to, you could start with a whitelist. If IPs are dynamic, try requiring a VPN connection. Either way, try to avoid port 22 or the 42s. You should use a key pair with a password on it. Key pair is recommended. It makes it so they can't brute force your password across the internet. Downside is if someone gets access to your laptop, they can steal those key pairs and then get in. So adding an extra password on it gives you more of an illusion of security. It's nice. And then SSH requires admin privileges on Synology. Not really sure why. QNAP used to be this way as well, from what I could tell, but a newer OS update has removed that requirement. If you're like me, you don't want your users to be SFTP in with admin privileges, you can set up a Docker container. Kind of removes the turnkey-ness of running SFTP on a Synology, but it's a little more secure. If you get one of these devices, you go to do data migration, you should sanitize your file names. This is a list of illegal characters. you should be looking for them. You can write scripts. This list is also documented well online. And then spaces at the end of file names, which I can't show, but they're a real day ruiner. I spent way too many hours trying to fight with those and get them renamed because people make the most broken file names somehow. So you really want to look through your data with a script, try to find these and fix them. Just a way to migrate, there's tons of ways. This one's worked really well for me. If you're coming from a Mac Mini, you can mount that Mac Mini storage over SMB onto your new shiny NAS, SSH into that NAS, and then run rsync to synchronize all of that data over to your new share. This lets you use that new hardware to do all that data processing, all that heavy lifting. That way, the old one's just feeding as fast as it can. It's going to feed you that data. This worked out really well for me in the past when my old server is acting up and it's stalling out, or it's going to take months to copy that data, which isn't viable. As soon as I mounted it and SSH'd into the new NAS, worked great. Some miscellaneous stuff. Only store data in shares. I ran into this problem pretty early on, wrote a script or two for backups, and hopped in one day, they were gone. My backup stopped working, script was gone. Pretty sure it was a Synology update. Probably treated it as temporary data, wiped it all out. Ever since then, I just store everything in a share, create one, make it an admin share, only you have access to it, and then put all your stuff in there. Don't change system config files. I see this a lot with running a Synology. You need to change the configuration on Nginx. I don't recommend doing it. If you really need to, sure, you can try it and make sure to document it. But as soon as Synology updates, they're going to overwrite that config probably. You're going to have to go in and make that change again. Or worst case scenario, they're going to make a change. It's going to be incompatible with your change and just break everything. So definitely document it if you're going to make those changes, and document why. That way future you is happy with past you, or the next person who comes in has something to go off of when everything breaks. If you're going to use L2TP over IPsec VPN on Synology, I don't know if this is a spec thing with L2TP or if this is with Synology, but you can only have one connection per WAN. So if I connect and then you connect, you're going to kick me off, next person's going to kick you off, and so on. It's even worse if you have NATing enabled on your firewall, because everything's going to come from your firewall. You can only have one person connected at a time then. So if that's going to be a problem, I recommend trying OpenVPN. It's, I think, more secure. And that's my recommendation for that. Synology's tier 2 response times are pretty slow. There's been a lot of complaining. I think they're based out of Taiwan, and they do a normal 8 to 5. We do a normal 8 to 5, and you're going to put in a ticket, and then you're going to hear back from them late at night. It just starts adding up. So if that's going to be a problem, you can try high availability to get that high uptime. That way when your unit's offline, you can get those responses and slowly get it back up without downtime. Or you might want to look at QNAP and see if they're better, or a Nimble, which might have better support, or any other vendor if that's going to be a problem. And then don't plug APFS drives into a Synology. Thanks, Steve, for figuring that one out for us. It was a bad day. It crashed I believe it crashed the USB driver on it, and it just took him down for a while.
Well, Sino stayed up, but it had a lot of other regrettable places.
Yeah.
It.
Yeah.
It's not instant death. You don't want to do it.
Yeah, it didn't go well. So yeah, don't plug in APFS drives. It can't handle it. So, question is, do we even still need a Mac server? Because server.app is dead to us. It's been gutted. I think the only thing left in it's profile manager. But there are still some macOS stuff. You can only run Xcode server or caching server or auto package on macOS. So if you need these things, you might still need a Mac server. And then there's some stuff that just requires macOS or Windows. Adobe Software Update Server, Font Explorer. I'm running both of these. It's either macOS or Windows. I'd rather run it in macOS. You might still need that Mac server around, even though you might migrate all the stuff that they pulled out to a NAS. It's okay. You might need it. So my conclusion is that macOS server is deprecated. They've pretty much pulled everything out, but you still might need it for some tasks. And that NASs are great. There's lots of storage. They're super versatile. They're relatively cheap. They're a great place to put all of your services and data if that's what you need. So I'm a little early, but just a quick wrap up. Mac Admin Slack, you should join us. There is a Synology and QNAP channel. Like I said earlier, we can help you out with some stuff and give you some advice if you need it. And then that is a QR code that's super ugly to my slides. But you can stalk me online, Cookie Lust, note that underscore. Slack, I'm Heinz. And then, yeah, my blog's kernelpanic.me, where you can find the slide. That's where the QR code goes to. I'd like to give a quick thanks to Robert Hammond, who helped me with the title, Chris Daw and Steve Uroff, who helped me with my proposal and some advice, and then Rick Heil, who let me ask him a bunch of questions about QNAP, because been a while. And all of you, thanks for listening to me ramble. Sorry I'm early. Any questions? Anyone? Uh-oh. I do actually have to throw this thing. All right, everyone look out. I have terrible depth perception. I nailed it. Yes.
Just a comment. I was looking at the Synology, and I ultimately decided on QNAP for my installations. A couple of things about the difference. QNAP does include Thunderbolt 3 ports if you want direct access to them, and Synology doesn't. And
Cool.
QNAP also does have phone support, which I have found incredibly helpful when Synology wouldn't do anything. Yeah. When I couldn't get Synology to even respond, the QNAP phone support really saved the day.
Yeah, Synology support does leave a lot to be desired, especially in enterprise. I've found that to definitely be the case.
We have QNAPs as well. One thing I have run into, just as a caution on QNAP, that Synology actually does well, is QNAP's running an older flavor of LDAP. So if you're trying to integrate with an IDP, QNAP is probably not going to work.
Gotcha.
Unless you're using Active Directory.
Okay.
I did have a question for when you were talking about drive selection. Do you have a recommendation for max size that kind of balances between having decent storage space but not having a rebuild time of 2 weeks?
That is a great question. I kind of just go with what I need. Probably looking at buying 10 or 12 terabyte drives in the near future for some. It's just kind of a risk that I feel like we have to take right now until we figure out a way to support larger disks with RAID, because RAID 6 is definitely running into the same problem with those larger drives now that RAID 5 has. And as far as I know, there's not much of a solution out there right now. I'm just kind of using the biggest drives and then having a backup.
How do you feel about a hot spare instead of a cold spare?
That's if you have the space for it, yeah, definitely use a hot spare. I think they work really great as long as you get those notifications that it flipped over to that and you have a bad drive. Those are perfectly viable. I don't use them just because I need all the space I can in my Synologies, but hot spares are definitely viable.
And then because we were looking at possibly switching to Synology, do all Synology support BTRFS? Because not all QNAPs do, only the very high-end ones do.
I believe so. Maybe the lowest end models wouldn't, but I think all of the models do now. I've even got a old 2012 model. It is a Plus series, but it even supports APFS. Don't do APFS. Supports ButterFS. So I think really definitely any model that you get a Plus series on, which you'll probably want to get either way, even if you're not going like high end, as long as you get like a Plus model, you should be able to do ButterFS.
And then just a comment for QNAP. Most of the middle to high end ones all now have built-in NVMe slots for caching.
Oh,
so
nice.
It doesn't take up a drive slot. You can put in 2 and build a striped RAID for caching.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah. Any other questions, comments, concerns, smart remarks?
Do you have any recommendations for ButterFS over ZFS, or like maybe different use cases for either?
Yeah. So, I mean, you're kind of stuck with one or the other depending on what vendor you go with. Some people don't like ButterFS. I don't remember the exact reasonings. I think they thought that it could be corrupt easier or something. I've never run into that or heard anyone who has run into that personally, which apparently he has. Oh, you have a question? Okay.
I can expand your comment.
Okay. So ZFS, some people like a lot more. Personally, I don't mind ButterFS. It runs really well for me. Was that, I lost train of thought. Was there any
No,
more to
just
that?
maybe a follow-up at performance testing between the two. Like
Ooh.
on the hardware, does one slightly perform better than the other? Does it? Do you know? Does anyone know? I guess.
I don't know. Steve, have you seen anything on that?
I don't know, but if you're saturating your Ethernet ports as much as you need to,
Does it matter?
how much does it matter?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, did you have a...
I was at a Linux user group meeting about 6 months ago, and a guy gave a talk on ZFS, and he obviously hates ButterFS.
Yeah.
But he had all these references from the ButterFS group of problems they had yet to fix.
Okay.
So, but it was almost a religious talk.
Yeah.
I haven't dug into it technically, but he definitely had his documentation ready.
Yeah. Yeah, there is some, fiery war between the two, but there's a question over there.
Yeah, I made a mistake a couple of months ago. I signed up for the Synology warnings.
Oh, okay. The notifications?
Yeah, notifications, and there are a bunch of them. And so how often do you have to deal with updating, patching the operating system?
So updating the I might have turned off the operating system one because I have a schedule where I'll go in and take it down at night for updates. So I don't get update ones. I can see how those could be pretty noisy because they update semi-frequently. I think I get notifications once a week, maybe definitely on once a month. It'll give me like a smart status report, stuff like that. Let me know how everything's running. But I might have pared down my notifications a little bit more to try to get just the hardware failures and any other failures. But software updates, on a schedule, I'll go in and do those manually. Does that answer your question?
QNAP,
Uh-huh.
as I recall, ZFS is only available on the enterprise grade
Yes.
units.
Okay.
Okay.
Enterprise only for ZFS.
Workflow-wise,
Uh-huh.
we're basically looking at replacing a Mac server.
Mhm.
Or in your workflow, do you have like Monkey running on Apache or Nginx, and like auto package pointing to your Synology and all that magic kind of working? Or I guess, how do you do it? Sorry, do you even use Monkey? I didn't even think about
Yeah,
that.
no, I do use Monkey. That's kind of a trick slide when I had Docker running Monkey. I've got the HTTPS on there, but it's synchronized over so far, and it's not live yet. But yeah, my plan is basically to mount the storage locally over SMB to a Mac Mini server, and then run auto package and have it dump all those packages to that. That's the workflow I'm kind of looking for.
That's kind of what I'm getting at is, can you have a Samba mount also be the same pointer to the web server on the Synology, I guess? Like, is that how that works?
Yeah. So, well, the way I'm going to do it is with Docker. So I'm going to run an HTTP Docker container, and I'm going to mount that volume using Docker. I'm going to mount that SMB share into the Docker container, and then I'm going to set up a reverse proxy in the control panel to, point monkey.simantel.com. Will then point to that Docker container and serve up all those files. So that's the workflow I'm looking at building. 0 laptops have been damaged so far. I'm impressed.
First of all, that's exactly what I do with my server that I've got my web root for Monkey is shared out as I'm using NFS for it, but you can SMB it or whatever, and my Mac Mini that runs auto package and does other stuff just mounts that, and that's the Monkey repo base that it's looking at, and it just throws things into the Synology, which is the web server. And I'm just using the native web server on it, which works perfectly fine. And for don't remember who it was that asked about like size of disks and 2-week rebuild times. Okay, as it would be, while I'm here at a conference, one of my drives and one of my Synos failed.
Oh, geez.
But I got another guy back at the office. He replaced it yesterday morning, and this is a RAID 6, 52.4 terabyte volume that's rebuilding, and it's 80% done.
What size was the drive?
Those are 6 terabyte drives.
Cool.
So on 6s, that's how long it's taking.
Any recommendations on RAM, upgrade RAM, go with whatever they have, depends on what services you're using?
That has been a little bit of a discussion in the Synology channel. I think people are using Crucial RAM a lot. Is that right, Steve? I feel like that's what I've seen a lot of people using. Stock RAM is a little low, I think, depending on the model. It typically is like 4 gig. I think I'm running 16 in mine, and that's been really, really solid for me. I know one of my older units had 4, and I was starting to run into like some weird slowness as it would start going over 60+% RAM utilization. Yeah, once dumping in 16 gigs of RAM really picked up that performance really well for me. Especially if you're going to run stuff in Docker, you're going to want to start wanting more RAM too. Way over there.
Just made it. You mentioned that there are illegal characters there. Are those just SMB restrictions, or are they something specific?
They are file system restrictions. Okay. I think that list specifically I pulled from Windows.
Okay. Yeah,
and I think that's there probably more restrictions on Windows, but I kind of go for the lowest common denominator. I'm going to have Windows machines accessing this stuff, and I don't want those to break too.
Right. All right. So a really dumb follow-up question.
Yeah.
If a user connected to this device via SMB attempts to save something with one of those restricted characters, will they get a dialog that pops up?
That's what I don't. So when I do it, I've tried to do this, like space at the end of file name, and then it does pop up and say, you can't do this. And then I go through and my backups are failing, and it's like this specific file, and I go to it, and it has a space at the end, and I don't know how. So somehow they are getting created, but typically, yeah, if you try to name your file name that, it's going to throw an error and not work.
I can speak to that because we had this massive issue when we moved our
too.
Files from the file server. They will allow you without dialogue to create them through AFP.
Okay.
So when you go back and access it through SMB, you'll error out.
Okay.
But if you connect via AFP, for some reason it allows you to bring in all these illegal characters that just start to massively screw up the system as it starts to do stuff. Which actually brings me to my other question, which is, do you use AFP since it's deprecated, and what are you using for Macs to access the NASs?
So I'm using AFP still because it's faster still. Yeah, it's going away. When it does go away, I'm just going to switch to SMB. And there are some tweaks you can make to SMB to make it faster. I think VS, it's a little debated. Steve, is VS Fruit available on Synology? I feel like some people have kind of hacked it on.
I believe you can get an edit at the smb.conf.
You can edit the SMB conf?
I don't want to say you can.
It's one of those two. It's a little risky just because Synology can override it or you could break it. I think I did see Synology Sport recommended not doing VS Fruit, which would give you a little bit more speed on SMB. But as of right now, yeah, I'm just running AFP, switching some people slowly over to SMB if there's some conflict or problem. But
QNAP specifically has an issue where if you're using any type of outside directory, be it LDAP or AD, you can, with SMB, you can only set permissions on one or the other. Either it's
Oh.
local users and groups
Uh-huh.
or network users and groups.
Okay. And
With
that was
AFP, there's no limitation.
Oh, okay.
And NFS doesn't really have any permissions, so.
Yeah. Interesting.
But that's why I asked, because
Gotcha.
there's not much
I
left.
haven't seen any problems mixing and matching.
Okay.
Questions back there?
We're contemplating moving an existing Mac server. Are there tools that will kind of look at files as they are in transit and being imported into Synology and do that renaming? Better find a
Depends
rename.
on what you're doing. So I'm in the middle of migrating some data around right now. What I've been doing is rsyncing that data, and then I can look up the command. We connect after. I can send you the rsync command. There's a way to dump the errors to a separate log. So I'm dumping errors to one log and clean data to another log. I go back and review that error log. Most of the time it's space at the end of a file name, which causes it to look like it's vanished. So what I do is I track all those down, and I start cleaning up all those file names, rerun that rsync command, and then it's just going to migrate any of that new data that I can now actually migrate. And so I've just been over and over running that rsync command to resynchronize all that data. On the fly, I'm not sure if there's any. I don't know if I would want to rename on the fly. I actually wrote a script. I wrote a script to rename those files, but I always had a human where I go in and hit enter on each one, just because I want to verify that name. Who knows? I'm human. I'm going to break something. So I want that human extra verification.
Okay, so I just went through this same process, not going to a NAS, going to a hybrid cloud on-prem system. And we had to run checks on everything ahead of time. And that's how we fixed the situation. There's plenty of software packages out there that will check for and report, so you can fix it in place before running. And that way, it makes your copy go a lot faster, a lot cleaner, and not have an issue. So, and a simple Google will get you any one of a dozen scripts or apps to do that.
Yeah, there are a lot of scripts out there for it.
Yeah. I did have a comment question kind of thing. So in the past, NASs were inexpensive because they were able to use more pointed software for the task of moving files from one place to another.
Okay.
But now with, QNAP, Synology, and a lot of those guys making it like, oh, you want it to be a web server too. You want it to be this, you want it to be that. It seems to me that unless you go with the very, very high-end units, the hardware just is not there to support all that functionality.
Yeah. Like if you're running to run Docker and also do all this other extra stuff and run all these things, the biggest thing is going to be RAM. You're just going to want more RAM. And a lot of them you can install third-party RAM. You just want to make sure you get something good and compatible, which is the tricky part. Because obviously Synology is not going to be like, hey, here's all the RAM you can buy from someone else and not us. But that's the biggest limitation I've always seen on them is RAM limitations. So as long as you just buy enough RAM for what you're planning on doing, I haven't seen a problem. But again,
You haven't seen anything CPU or even disk I/O, situations?
Not really, not in normal stable environments. We had a 2012, just the original Synologies we got for Simantel were those like desktop, massive 12 bay boxes. And we had 3 of them all plugged in, or 2 expansion units plugged into a base unit. And on that one, I was running into high CPU utilization, high RAM usage, which again, we only had maybe 4 gigs of RAM.
Right.
And that's when I ended up saying like, these are 5 years old. It's time to move to something new, get more RAM on it. And I think there was some hardware failure component to it that wasn't necessarily showing up because it was just starting to fault slowly because I would get really high, I think it was disk IO, or not disk IO, but like there's a process, I think it's called disk IO, that would be really high utilization, but my disks weren't really super active.
Okay.
So in that case, I ended up having to move to a new Synology for that. But again, it was older hardware, so it's the only time I've really run into high CPU utilization. Everything else has been pretty solid. And I am also running higher end models, though, typically with Xeon processors.
Yeah.
So it's,
Yeah, if you get a device without a good processor in there, you're going to suffer down the road.
Yeah, it's just surprising, because looking at the marketing, it's like, okay, you can buy, off of Amazon, this $1,500 thing, fill it up, bunch of drive it. Look at all this stuff you can do. And I like, no, no, you're not gonna do
yeah,
that.
You do
it's,
it all at one time.
Right.
some of those cheaper ones, yeah, you might only be able to run, maybe you just run a Plex server off of it and you get a Play model, or you just run a bunch of Docker containers, or you just buy it for storage and that's all it's good at.
Right.
Yeah, if you're buying lower end models, it might not run as smooth for everything. Might have to pick and choose. Got a question right here up front. Oh, one more thing. Something else. Sorry, real quick. Before, with illegal characters, something else to look at is path limits. There's still, Windows still can't accept more than 255 characters in a path. So you want to keep an eye out for those as well.
Sorry if you already addressed this. Your company's creative marketing?
Yeah.
Okay. Are you working Adobe apps off the server?
So
Photoshop, InDesign?
not
Illustrator?
typically not directly off
Okay.
off that Synology. That's only because we also have Dell servers that we're running off of that currently. That's going to change a little bit. We're going to be running. I'm planning on migrating. We've got a video server. I'm planning on migrating that to Synology and getting a new Synology for that. And then we will be running, Premiere Pro off of that Synology. I think Steve is using it for all of his Adobe. Your creatives are using Adobe. Is it running well for you on that? I would assume so, but
Despite being advised not to.
yeah,
Are they
yeah,
SMB?
it's
I have both AFP and SMB on, but if you don't declare a protocol now in the Finder, you get SMB. So the majority of them are SMB, except those who have either a legacy bookmark or have chosen to type in AFP.
This is Synology?
Yes.
yeah. So all Synology, it's running decently well, even though people shouldn't be, which never works out that way.
No.
Don't do this. Yeah, well, I want to. So here we are. Cool. Way in the back, there's a question if you want to.
Where?
It's right here.
Ready?
I've got on an Apple server a mix of mostly Macs, a few virtual Windows systems, a few real Windows systems. The Windows are all using SMB, Macs using AFP, except we tried to switch some of the Macs to SMB. I would suggest not using both.
Okay.
It just, we get into weird, suddenly nobody can touch this folder till an admin goes and steps on it. Or the Windows guys can't see a folder, or the Mac guys can't see a folder. It's just, things get tight. It could be due to the Mac server, but
Yeah.
it's just gets weird.
I can't say I've run into a problem, but we're mostly Mac based, and a lot of our Windows machines are all like accounting, so they're not touching those.
These are all the people having trouble are CAD users, using
Okay.
Mac CAD, Windows CAD, and Office, all in the same folder mix, and so it is headaches.
And that probably is a normal. So I know our video guys, they when they connect, for a while they were connecting with both AFP and SMB, and they were running into similar problems where the paths are completely different. And they also run into the same problems switching between Mac and Windows. So we have a couple of render PCs, and if they open a project on their Mac and then they go over to that render PC to do some more heavy rendering and editing on it, they run into a lot of problems with the paths. So yeah, mixing and matching can be kind of harsh. But any other questions? Up front.
I don't want to ask this question, but I will. Do you run any antivirus or anti-malware on your NASs?
I don't.
I don't want to, but
I mean, I don't. I can't say that's necessarily maybe the best move. Probably depends on your environment too. Yeah, I don't really have much to say to that besides I don't, and I don't know if I recommend not doing it or if I recommend to do it.
well, I saw that purchased 5 Synology units.
Okay,
Currently
wow.
getting them all up and running. And, I was like, well, let me see what they have. And they have Synology has their own kind of branded antivirus in
Yeah,
there.
in the package
and then
center.
McAfee's in there, but it's kind of.
But it's McAfee.
We're a McAfee shop.
Yeah.
So it's like McAfee, home McAfee.
Okay.
It's not really designed to be used because
Yeah.
we have EPO. So, and I couldn't find anything where it could be EPO managed or
Yeah.
anything. McAfee seems to have a NAS product, but they don't really talk about it.
Oh, really? You might run into that CPU and RAM problem if you
Yeah.
start running McAfee specifically, but
Yeah, I was just wondering.
yeah, no,
Just in case the higher ups come wandering around. What are these Mac people doing over here?
right.
You know?
No, yeah, I
They
don't.
usually stay out of my
I-
hair, but
Yeah, I don't know if I'd recommend running or not running one. Again, I mean, if you're in a government position, you might want to run one. If you're high target, you
Higher
might want to run one.
education.
Yeah,
and
you definitely might want to run one if you're higher ed. There's jerks like me who were in high school doing all sorts of anything I could to try to break something.
that is true. And also, does the reverse proxy support custom certificates besides Let's Encrypt? If
Yeah,
I already have a certificate.
so I actually don't use. The Let's Encrypt support is for a single domain, and that domain has to be able to access the web. I've got some internal stuff that doesn't touch that, so I generate a wildcard certificate actually using Docker. Generate a wildcard certificate, and then I import that manually in, which is kind of a pain, but I've been trying to figure out a way to automate it. I haven't been able to figure out how to automate that import, but you can import third-party certificates, and then if you go in control panel to the security, there's a certificate section. You add it there, import it, and then you can also configure what services use that. And that includes, once you start creating reverse proxy domains, those will show up in that list, and then you can just
I
set.
have one external IP
Mhm.
that's going to come in for Monkey.
Yeah, then
It
you'll.
only does HTTPS, so.
Yeah.
And it goes through like 3 proxies out, so
Oh, geez.
so the certificate has to be exactly what's in all of the
Right.
places to make it work. So
Yeah, and I'm working on a post too there's a way to redirect HTTP to HTTPS as well with the reverse proxy. So I'm working on like a quick post on, you basically just create use the wizard to create 2 different reverse proxies. One points to the HTTPS, and then you can translate it, because I don't want to have to type, I want to be lazy and just type HTTP or whatever, or have it just auto go there. I don't have to think about it. So I don't want my users to have to think about it. But questions? More? Right behind you.
Yeah, right. Sweet, box. We've got a client that is hoping, they're starting to worry about their Mac server going up to the grade Mac server farm in the sky. And they've really, really heavily against any cloud solutions. They want to keep
Okay.
everything in-house, so there
Yeah.
we are. Their Open Directory setup is kind of convoluted, like lots of very specific and irritating permissions are set up for folder access, 'cause they're really neurotic about individual employees getting into just the right things.
Yep.
And so for something like this, I'm guessing that the workflow would generally go, copy their OD structure, get that set up on the device, sort of comb through the users and groups to make sure that's in place, then copy all the individual shares and hope all their InDesign links don't break.
I mean, they're probably going to break anyway, unless, well, if you can get the same IP and maybe the same DNS name, it might stay, but it's probably going to break if you change either of those. Just because that base URL will change.
Yep. And so even, right now they're doing their splits of their AFP and SMB. So we've got people hitting both, but I guess question also for the room, if Adobe uses hard links for that, or relative links for?
So like in the InDesign,
Yeah.
when it's pointing back, is
Because
it?
they will not, that's like the biggest thing. They're saying, we'll buy another Mac Mini and we'll just install it and hope for the best, as long as it means that their links stay up.
I think they're hard links, but I don't.
I'm hoping.
I'm migrating people to OneDrive.
Yeah.
And any little change, because you have to do the same file name
Yeah,
and stuff. So
any
if you
change
want
will
scripts for
mess with it.
Look for OneDrive examples, because there's those out there.
Mm.
But any of those moves, I have people who have terabytes of data, and they go back and try to access something from 10 years ago.
is.
And it doesn't work. I'm like, if it works, you just have to resources because they're hard links, so.
Okay.
You will, it's eventually gonna catch up. So.
Fair enough.
So they are hard links and it'll break.
Okay, thanks.
Cool.
Yeah.
I remembered there was a technology on QNAP, which I haven't tested, and I don't know if you or anybody in the room knows about. They call it auto tiering. So if you have an SSD array, a SAS array, and then a regular SATA array, they'll tier your data to the appropriate array based on how often it's accessed.
Okay, kind
And
of like
I'm
almost like an Apple Fusion,
Yeah.
but to a much larger scale.
Yeah, but I'm curious if anybody's used anything like that, because it frightened the hell out of me, quite honestly.
Yeah, I didn't even know that existed. Anyone? Uh-oh.
Okay, so I can't speak to Synology or QNAP, but pretty much any of the big boy companies out there like Nexan, who's downstairs, and other companies like that, their auto tiering processes are pretty solid, because that's actually what one of the advantages of running them is, to get the data to the appropriate place at the appropriate time. So I can't speak for Synology and QNAP, but the higher end guys, that stuff works really well.
Cool. More questions?
Okay. Who can I badly throw this to?
Cool. Well, thanks for coming, everyone. Have a good day.